A voice against the silence. In this place, where the only immutable constant was threat, the name given at birth lost its weight. It was rubbed away by dirt, covered with dust, replaced by a call sign. Short, concise, functional. My call sign was Malva. Malva. Mallow, a flower. A symbol of Ukraine, a symbol of summer, warmth and peace. In the trench where only earth, metal, and fear reigned, this name sounded like a thin, mocking contrast. I, a person who worked in programming before the war, created logic and structure in the digital world, was now Malva, the bearer of a voice against the mounting silence. My job was not to shoot, my job was to connect. I was the nerve of this section of the front, a thin yet stubborn thread that bound these people to the command, and through it, to the reality that still remembered peace. In the trench that became my home, I felt like a foreign body. My hands, accustomed to the smooth plastic of a keyboard and the cold metal of a mouse, were now rough, covered with cracks from dirt and cold. My mind, accustomed to the impeccable logic of code, was forced to work in a world of chaos, randomness, and unpredictable cruelty. I often remembered my former life. I remembered not events, but smells. The smell of hot coffee in the morning silence. The smell of clean, fresh laundry. The smell of rain on asphalt. These memories were priceless, but also agonizing. They were portals to a world that may have vanished forever. My equipment, that was my world. Radio stations, batteries, cables, they were an extension of my will. My task was to ensure a clean signal, so that the voice did not tremble, did not break, was not drowned out by interference. I was the filter between the war and the command. I had to let the truth pass through, but cut out the noise. In the morning, before the sun dared to appear over the line of trenches, I conducted a revisal. Every contact, every terminal, every meter of wire, everything had to be flawless. In this world where the slightest mistake could cost a life, precision was a religion. I sat in the dugout, which was more like a burrow. The dugout was cold, damp, its walls weeping with condensation. But it was mine. It was my workstation, my refuge, my monastic cell. I was the voice against the silence. At night, when the front quieted down, this silence was unbearable. It was filled with what the artillery could not express: sorrow, fear, and endless anticipation. I would turn on the radio station, and its quiet hum was the only pulse I heard. I often thought about how they, those beyond this trench, saw me. Did they see Malva, the programmer who traded code for cable, or did they just see a soldier, a cog in a huge military machine? My most important job, that was the job of waiting. I waited for the signal, waited for the command, waited for the end of this endless pause. Time flowed differently in the trench. It was viscous, sluggish, like the clay I sat in. Days merged into a single dirty mass, and only the flashes of artillery served as landmarks in this geometry of fear. I remembered my daughter. She loved fairy tales, and now I lived in my own fairy tale where the dragon was real and the hero was simply a radio operator. My battle was internal, a battle for the preservation of logic in a world of madness. My sorrow was physical. It constricted my chest. It made my breathing shallow. I missed not great events, but the small things. The smell of homemade soup, the sound of a closing door, the feeling of a clean, dry floor under my feet. I was a signaler. My task was to connect not only military points, but two worlds, the world of the trench and the world of home. And this thin, invisible thread of connection was fragile, but the most important thing in my life. I had to protect it because it was my only window into what still remained human. Sometimes, when I was alone, I would take out a letter from my wife,
written in a simple, even handwriting. I did not read it. I felt its weight. It was proof that out there, beyond the front line, life continues, and that my call sign has meaning. I was Malva, a voice against the silence, and as long as my voice was clean and my cable intact, I knew that this war was not yet won by them.
The geometry of the trench. My new home had no roof, no address, and no windows with a view of a blooming garden. It had the geometry of the trench, a rough, uneven, but absolutely necessary logic, carved into clay and earth. It was a space that was the reverse of civilization, not a house above ground, but a burrow running deep, the only guarantee that I would survive the next hour. The trench is a philosophical concept that has become a physical reality. Its basic idea, salvation, is underground. It was an extended, winding wound on the body of the field, a man-made scar that stretched, repeating the relief of fear. My Malva, the former programmer, studied this geometry with the pedantry of an engineer. Length, depth, width, these parameters were not just numbers. They were the distance between life and death. The top edge of the trench, its parapet, brustefer, was the dividing line between my world and the alien world. It was stacked with sandbags, saturated with moisture and fear. Looking over it meant risking everything. My sight was now fixed on the lower plane, on the trench floor, on the mud that was its only floor. My dugout, Semyanka, my communications office, was the heart of this geometry. It was a niche dug into the trench wall, reinforced somewhat with wooden beams that constantly groaned under the weight of the earth. Inside, there was no room to stand. Life here was half bent, compressed, constantly ready to fall to the ground. The table, it was a small, shaky box on which my equipment stood. Radio stations, batteries, tangled balls of cable, all of this was my pulse, my connection to reality. I sat, hunched over this box, and my body took the shape of this cramped, damp space. The walls of the trench were a mirror of my state. In wet weather, they wept mud and moisture. The marks of shovels were visible in them, crude strokes of human labor that had ripped this refuge from the earth. These walls were cold and unwelcoming, but they were the only guarantee. They were an anti-home, but the most honest home I had known. I, Malva, a man of logic, understood that the geometry of the trench is a pure, primitive code of survival. Bends. Every bend of the trench was protection from direct fire. It was a loop that caught shrapnel. Life in the trench was a constant movement along this curved line, never in a straight line. Depth. Depth was a temporary indicator. It changed with every rain, with every strike. The deeper, the more time for reaction, the less chance of a direct hit. It was the mathematics of fear. My sleeping place. It was a thin board covered with an old, wet blanket. Sleep here was intermittent, shallow. Sleep in the trench is not rest, but a short pause in combat readiness. My hearing remained switched on, even when my eyes were closed. The most terrifying element of this geometry was the exit point, the steps leading to the observation post. It was a line of risk that I crossed to lay cable, check the antenna, or simply look at the world that lay beyond this clay womb. Every time I went up, I felt my body resist. It knew that light and air are enemies. Safety was in the darkness and underground. The geometry of the trench dictated the geometry of my soul. My former directness and openness were replaced by the curved line of caution and isolation. I was a signaler, but my physical world was locked. My mind, Malva, continued to work. I mapped the trench in my head, creating a digital model of this analog hell. I knew every crack in the wall, every puddle on the floor,
every groan of the beam. This was my knowledge, and it gave me control in a world where control was an illusion. In the quiet hours, when I sat listening to the rustle of the earth, I felt the trench become a living creature. It breathed with dampness, groaned under shelling, and protected me. It was my mother and my prison. In this depression in the earth, I discovered the true meaning of the word home. Home is not a place where comfort awaits you. Home is a place where the earth protects you, where you are one with fear and one with hope. My Malva, the logic, the connection, all of this had to work in this geometry, and as long as the trench held, I held.
The sound filter. In the trench, the main organ became not the eye, but the ear. Sight was limited by the parapet and the clay walls, but hearing was a portal to the vast, dangerous world that lay beyond my earthly burrow. My life, as Malva, as a signaler, depended on my ability to analyze this sound chaos. My adaptation to the front was primarily an adaptation of hearing. The brain, accustomed to music, conversation, and silence, was forced to urgently create a sound filter, a complex neural program that had to cut out the noise and isolate the signal. The chaos was loud but monotonous. It was the background of war, the crackle of branches, the rustle of the earth, the distant low hum of generators. This was the white noise of danger. My task was to penetrate through it and hear the threat or the instruction. The threat had its own hierarchy of sounds. Grad, which is the rocket system, the most terrifying sound. It began with a distant, rising, whistling rush, similar to a swarm of steel bees. Then followed a terrifying rising scream that culminated in a physical impact that shook the earth. The main rule: hear the first rustle when the sound does not yet seem like a threat, to have time to warn. Mortar, it was a sudden high clap somewhere too close, immediately followed by a dull, strong impact. It gave no time for reflection, it demanded an immediate reaction, dropping to the ground. Artillery, a loud but relatively slow roar that gave a few seconds to identify the direction and take cover. This sound was the background of our existence. My sound filter worked constantly. It was switched on even in sleep. It gave me no rest. It turned my hearing into a weapon and a curse. But my main job was connected to the radio waves. The airwaves were a mirror of the front. They were filled with noise, fragments of words, static and interference. My task as Malva was to transform chaos into logic. I had to filter out everything superfluous, random crackling, the noise of machinery, alien call signs not related to us. I had to single out the pure voice, the clear instruction. In this auditory hell, every second had a price. A wrongly heard word, a missed pause, an incorrectly identified call sign, all of it could cost the lives of our unit. The responsibility lay on my ears and my concentration. I sat in my dugout semi-bent with headphones on my head, and my body was motionless like a stone idol. Only my fingers moved, tuning frequencies, adjusting the volume. I was the mediator between the world that screams and the world that waits for a decision. I recalled how in my former life I filtered the noise of the office to concentrate on code, but here was noise of death, and the price of error was immeasurably higher. The hardest thing was to filter my own emotions. Fear was noise that tried to drown out the signal. When the earth shook, when the ceiling groaned, my logic tried to shut down, but I had to hold myself. My fingers had to remain calm and my voice steady. I had to speak into the airwaves with a steady, unemotional tone. The information had to be clean, dry, without traces of my fear or my fatigue. My voice was a mask I wore to protect not only myself, but also those who listened. When I heard the commander's voice in the headphones, it was the voice of logic, the voice of order. That voice was a hard stone I clung to in the raging sea of chaos. My job was to maintain that hardness. Sometimes through the crackling and static, I heard fragments of alien conversations, quick, nervous call signs, varied sighs. These fragments were human sparks in the radio ocean. They reminded me that we are not alone, that thousands of Malvas sit in thousands of similar trenches, filtering chaos and connecting threads. My sound filter became a part of my soul. It permanently changed my perception of the world. I knew that when I returned home, I would continue to filter. I would filter out the noise of the city and seek the pure signal of life, my daughter's voice, my wife's quiet laugh. But while I was here, in this damp, cold geometry, I was Malva, the filter, and my concentration was the only guarantee that our voice would be heard.
The Lost Sweater. The trench, despite its clay protection, was constantly cold. The cold was ubiquitous. It penetrated through the damp uniform, through the thin, worn gloves. It burrowed into the bones and froze thoughts. In this world of dampness and cold, I, Malva, waged a constant, silent war against the mundane. The battle for warmth was foundational. It took away as much mental energy as sound filtration. The body, constantly under tension, demanded rest and comfort, but the trench offered only earth and moisture. I sat, hunched over the radio station, and my fingers, which had to be precise and quick, were wooden from the cold. I tried to warm them by rubbing them together, but they only exchanged a feeling of hopelessness. I thought, how can you save lives if you cannot warm your own hands? It was in these moments of physical weakness that my consciousness inevitably turned to home. Not to the image of home, not to an abstract idea, but to a specific, tangible object that symbolized warmth, care, and safety. That object was the lost sweater. It was an old, thick, woolen sweater that my wife had knitted. It was useless in the city, too bulky and scratchy, but in the trench it would be an invaluable treasure. I remembered its color, dark blue with an irregular but cozy pattern on the chest. I remembered its smell, the smell of clean, domestic detergent mixed with the aroma of her perfume. I left it at home. In the rush of packing, in the chaos of that last day, I decided it was too large and out of place. It was a mistake that now costs me warmth and peace. The lost sweater became a metaphor for everything I had lost. It was a symbol of carelessness, the certainty that tomorrow would be warm and safe. It was a thread of comfort that was cut by my own short-sightedness. I imagined it lying at home now. Perhaps it was moved to the top shelf, forgotten. It was a peaceful object in a time of war. And its absence here, in this cold geometry, was a physical reminder of the chasm that separated the two worlds. I closed my eyes and tried to feel its weight and warmth on my shoulders. I imagined the wool prickling, how it warmed my frozen skin. In these minutes, the memory of the sweater was stronger than the actual cold. It was self-deception, but necessary for survival. My longing for the lost sweater was a longing for touch, for the touch of my wife who knitted it, for the touch of comfort it promised. In the trench, human touch was a rarity, and warmth was a treasure. I saw how other soldiers dealt with the cold. Someone wrapped himself in old, dirty army coats. Someone shared the last sip of hot tea. It was a brotherhood of cold, where warmth was transmitted through community and mutual aid. But my sweater was a personal, intimate symbol. It was a bridge to my family. I knew that when I returned, I would find it. I would put it on, and its warmth would mix with the cold that would forever remain in my bones. And that would be the symbol of my return, the union of military cold and domestic warmth. My work continued. I had to maintain logic, filter sounds, connect threads. But every time the cold penetrated too deep, my consciousness retreated into that blue woolen ball of the lost sweater and found enough warmth there to continue its mission. I was Malva, the signal operator, the guardian of the voice. And my fight against the cold was a fight for memory, for the right to warmth, and the right to return.
The cable in the mud. If the trench was my home, then the communication cable was my umbilical cord. It was the physical extension of my will, the material thread that connected me, Malva, to the center of decision-making, to logic and order. This cable was my main responsibility, my cross and my hope. The cable was inconspicuous, thick, covered with a rubberized sheath, and dirty. It ran from my dugout along the floor of the trench, went beyond the parapet, and disappeared into the dead, rutted earth of the gray zone. Its path was long, winding, and incredibly dangerous. Laying and repairing this cable was a sacred ritual. It was not just a technical task. It was a physical act of faith that communication and coordination were more important than chaos and chance. Every time the connection was broken, most often by shrapnel or ground subsidence, my heart constricted with realization. A broken cable meant disconnection from the world, loss of protection, surrender of reason. My task as Malva, as the voice operator, was to immediately find the break and restore the thread. This work always happened at the most inconvenient moments, under the roar of artillery and pouring rain, or in the suffocating silence that was worse than shelling. I recalled how in my former life I laid cables for computer networks, clean, thin wires that ran along smooth, dry walls. Here, the cable was submerged in the mud. I had to crawl after it, feel it, search for the thin, critical wound in its durable sheath. The cable in the mud was a metaphor for my life. My essence, logic, the purity of information, was submerged in chaos, dirt, and physical suffering. But the essence had to remain whole. When I found the break, it was like finding a nerve that needed to be sutured. I took out my tools, my soldering irons, and electrical tape. This was a surgical process in field conditions. My fingers, frozen and calloused, had to acquire the precision of a watchmaker. I had to clean the copper strands of dirt, twist them together with flawless reliability, and seal them with electrical tape so that moisture would not penetrate and destroy the voice. Every restored section of the cable was a small victory of reason over chance. It was proof that we control what we can control. It was an act of pride. I restored the connection. I brought back the voice. The most dangerous part of the cable was located beyond the trench, there where the earth was churned up and exposed to enemy eyes. To go out there, to crawl on my belly, to feel the cold, wet clay in search of the thin black line, this was the highest act of risk. I remembered the feeling when the hot lead of artillery whistled over my head, while I, lying on my stomach, tried to connect two ends. In those moments, fear was deafening, but duty was louder. I could not refuse, because a break meant silence, and silence meant defeat. The communication cable was not just a technical device. It was a prayer, a faith in another person. It was trust. I trusted it to carry my voice, and it trusted me to protect it from destruction. I saw how other soldiers looked with envy at my work tool. They understood its value. In their world, an assault rifle was a means of defense, but the cable was a means of coordination, a means of victory. I often thought about what this cable carried. It carried not only encrypted commands and loss reports. It carried hope, longing, plea, and fatigue. It was a capillary through which information flowed, the vital blood of the front. When I returned dirty, exhausted, with a soaked uniform after repairing the cable, I felt a huge, quiet satisfaction. I had returned the voice to this silent world. I had connected the thread. My geometry of the trench was dependent on the cable in the mud, and as long as the cable was intact, I, Malva, the keeper of the voice, the programmer who traded code for copper, held on.
5 minutes of peace. Connection with home was the greatest luxury and the greatest risk. It was a violation of all rules of professional discipline and personal safety. But the human need for that voice was stronger than any statute. The moment of 5 minutes of peace came unexpectedly, like a flash of lightning in a dark night. It was a permission torn from the harsh rules of the front, a temporary loophole allowed by an operational lull, or a rare stroke of luck in finding an intact, stable network. I, Malva, the man of cable and airwaves, knew the price of this connection. My hearing and memory had to work with doubled force to register every word, every nuance of the voice that traveled across hundreds of kilometers, overcoming the crackle of interference and the threat of severance. It was a ritual. I retreated to the farthest, quietest corner of the dugout, turned off all working radio stations, and took out the concealed personal device, a small, worn phone. Its screen seemed unnaturally bright in the twilight of my burrow. I dialed the familiar, sacred number. My heart beat heavily, dully, like a hammer on an anvil. Every second of waiting for the dial tone was an eternity, filled with fear. What if she doesn't answer? What if the connection breaks? What if something happened on the other end? And then the voice. My wife's voice. It was quiet, trembling, but recognizable. It was music, architecture, logic, everything I had lost and sought to restore. The voice spoke of small things, of our daughter getting an A, of the cat scratching the wallpaper, of the rain that started and stopped. These were simple, peaceful facts, but for me, sitting in the clay geometry, they were the foundation of reality. I absorbed every word, filtering out the artificial optimism and the concealed anxiety. I heard how the voice tried to be strong, tried to be calm so as not to transmit her own fear to me, and I answered her with the same mask, a steady, unemotional tone. Everything is fine here. It's dry. The connection is working. The lie was necessary. I could not transmit the smell of gunpowder, the cold of the clay, the weight of responsibility to her. I had to create the illusion that Malva was the same person she remembered. The 5 minutes of peace were a temporary rift in the space-time continuum of the trench. In those minutes, the roar of the front receded. It became a distant, meaningless noise. My only world was the thin, fragile thread of the voice. I remembered the lost sweater and knew the voice was warmer and more valuable than any wool. It was the energy that sustained my logic and my will. When the voice spoke of our daughter, I saw her face. I saw her laughter, her confusion, her curiosity. These were clean, undistorted images that filled my emptiness. I understood that I was here not only to connect wires. I was here for the preservation of this voice, this laughter, this small piece of life. And then the time was running out, always too quickly. The connection began to crackle. Static broke into the intimate space of our conversation. It was the sound filter stopping its work, returning me to reality. The final words were always the most important. I love you. Waiting. I love you. Take care. Then a click. Severance. Silence. I sat motionless, with the cold phone in my hand. The 5 minutes of peace were over. The front rushed at me with all its force. The roar of artillery returned, threatening, inevitable. But I was full. The voice was preserved. It was recorded in the deepest part of my memory, like a reliable, unbreakable code. I returned to the working radio stations, my sound filter switched on again, but now my mission had a new meaning. My cable in the mud was a bridge to the voice, and I had to keep it intact until the day the voice became a physical presence. I was Malva, the keeper of the voice. And for those 5 minutes of peace, it was worth enduring everything else.
The night at the front was long, cold, and exceptionally loud. It was a time when the body demanded rest, but the consciousness entered a phase of hyperbolic wakefulness. My monologues of the night were the only unwritten diary I kept, a dialogue between Malva, the man, and Malva, the function. Duty in the night shift was the hardest trial. In the darkness, the geometry of the trench lost its contours, turning into a black, damp womb full of invisible threats. The sounds that were differentiated during the day by my sound filter became a homogeneous, terrifying background noise at night. I sat in the dugout, chained to the radio station. My mind was expanded. It scanned not only the airwaves but also the surrounding space. I felt the weight of the earth overhead, the cold penetrating through my clothes, and the endless, slow passage of time. Time in the trench behaved strangely. During the day, it compressed into critical moments of shelling, demanding instantaneous reaction. At night, it stretched into endless, viscous hours. Every minute was a brick I had to endure to survive until dawn.
My sorrow was amplified by the darkness. At night, memories of the 5 minutes of peace, of the wife's voice became sharp, burning. I recalled the smell of her hair, the warmth of her hand. These memories were invaluable energy, but also a painful contrast to my current cold, dirty reality. To keep from going mad from the confinement and isolation, I allowed myself to look at the stars. This was the main ritual of my night shift. I crawled out to the observation post, a dangerous open area, and pressed against the parapet, I lifted my eyes. The sky above the Zaporizhzhia direction was black, velvety, and scattered with millions of cold lights. The stars were absolute peace. They were absolute logic. Their infinity and indifference to our small, localized war gave psychological relief. They were constant. They burned just as they did thousands of years ago, before all wars, before all suffering. I, Malva, the former programmer, thought about the cosmic code, about the laws of gravity, about the flawless geometry of planetary motion. In the trench, where madness and randomness reigned, the cosmos offered order. The stars were a beacon. They reminded me of another world, vast, immense, where my little trench was an invisible speck of dust. This humility was salvific. It reduced the scale of my fear. I found the constellations we studied with my daughter from old dusty books. The Big Dipper, it was recognizable, unchanged. It was a proof that our world, the world of family, peace, logic, continues to exist somewhere out there under this sky. I looked at the Milky Way, that road of light, and imagined my communication cable was a tiny, dirty thread trying to connect the dirt of the trench with the purity of the cosmos. The night was also a time for memory work. My consciousness wandered freely, switching off the sound filter and diving into memories. I recalled warm summer evenings at the dacha, the smell of cut grass, the quiet hum of cicadas. I recalled how we lit the lantern on the veranda and how the light from it chased away the darkness. Here in the trench, the darkness was absolute, and light was an enemy that could betray my position. I often recalled my desk in the office, clean, organized, with 2 large monitors. The screens shone with blue and green light, reflecting flawless code. Here, my workspace was a cold crate and damp clay. This amplitude of contrast was a psychological hammer that constantly struck at my identity. The monologue of the night was honest. I confessed my fear, my longing, my fatigue to myself. I asked myself the main question: what will be left of me after all this? Will I be able to become a programmer again? Will I be able to see order in chaos again? I knew that this war would forever change the geometry of my soul. My straightness would disappear. I would always seek shelter, always filter sounds, always wait for the connection to break. The night, despite its inhuman length, was ending. And as the sky began to turn gray in the east and the stars faded, I felt a new surge of strength. Dawn brought clarity and visibility. Visibility was safety. My sound filter switched to day mode. I was once again Malva, the function, the signaler. I descended back into the dugout, feeling the cold, but knowing that the night was endured. The stars had preserved my logic.
The alien blanket. The trench was a cold, egoistic geometry, demanding concentration on one's own survival. But human nature, even pressed down by clay and fear, refused to fully submit to this primitive logic. Inside the dirty, damp trench, there existed an unwritten law, the law of brotherhood, expressed in quiet, anonymous acts of mutual aid. I, Malva, the human function, observed this silent community from my communication corner. My position, chained to the equipment,
made me an external observer, a chronicler of the daily life and spiritual movements of those who shared this piece of earth with me. Cold was our common enemy. In the fight against it, the instinct of self-preservation battled the instinct of community. In my memory, the lost sweater still lived, a symbol of lost personal warmth. But here, in the trench, warmth was collective. I watched Serhiy, a name I knew, but which I used only in my mind, not breaking the monologic silence. Serhiy was a machine gunner, young, taciturn, with eyes full of heavy fatigue. His shift was the cruelest, a long, motionless wait at the observation post where the wind and cold penetrated to the bone. One day, after an especially cold, sleepless night, when the moisture of the earth felt like liquid ice, Serhiy returned to the dugout. He was pale, his lips trembled, his movements were sporadic. He fell onto his thin mat, trying to warm up, but his body merely shook uncontrollably. Next to him slept Ivan, the oldest in our squad, a quiet, surly man who always seemed self-sufficient and detached. His only possession, which he guarded more than his weapon, was the alien blanket. The blanket was old, woolen, with a bright, faded but recognizable pattern, a geometrical ornament that clearly belonged to a peaceful pre-war era. It was a piece of someone else's home that now served as a lifeline in our underground reality. Ivan never shared it. It was his personal, inviolable territory of warmth. I, Malva, the human function, expected Serhiy to suffer in the cold until he warmed up with his own body heat or fell asleep from exhaustion. But I witnessed a quiet, astonishing act. Ivan woke up. He didn't lift his head, didn't make a sound. He only stretched his hand out from under his precious blanket and felt for Serhiy's feet. He slowly and cautiously, without opening his eyes, covered the young machine gunner's trembling feet with the blanket. It was a silent, instinctive gesture, a gesture that denied the egoism of the trench and affirmed the necessity of collective survival. He sacrificed a part of his own warmth for a neighbor he barely knew, but with whom he was bound by the unity of fate. He did not expect gratitude. He did not seek validation for his action. His hand returned under the blanket and he fell asleep again, as if nothing had happened. Serhiy, feeling the unexpected warmth on his feet, quieted down. His body stopped shaking. He groaned softly, deeply, as if releasing the accumulated fatigue. He did not open his eyes either. He simply accepted this alien warmth as a gift and a right. This moment was for me, Malva, a new lesson in the geometry of the trench. The trench was not only a burrow for protection, but a laboratory of humanity. Here, where everything superfluous was cut away, only the essence remained, the capacity to care for another. The alien blanket became a symbol of collective survival. It was a bridge between personal property and common need. It reminded us that the strongest defense in the trench is not the thickness of the parapet, but the thickness of the human heart. I, Malva, the signal operator who fought my sorrow through cold digital code, saw that genuine warmth lies in an analog, woolen gesture. I fixed this in the vault of my consciousness, the alien blanket, an artifact of brotherhood. It spoke of how even when the voice is lost, humanity continues to work through a quiet, instinctive gesture. This act of mercy justified the suffering. It substantiated the necessity of our struggle. We were fighting not only for the land, but for the right to such quiet, anonymous manifestations of goodness and warmth. I continued my duty, but now the cold seemed less piercing. I knew that even if my lost sweater remained in a distant, peaceful home, the alien blanket preserved warmth here, in the earthy womb. And this collective warmth was enough for Malva to continue holding the connection.
The diary on the pack. The war I was fighting was not only external, but internal. The external enemy threw lead and shrapnel at me, but the internal enemy, chaos, disorientation, and the erasure of identity, was far more insidious.
The trench is a machine for turning a person into a function. I became Malva, the voice, the filter, the connecting thread. If I allowed myself to completely dissolve into this function, I risked losing myself forever. I risked Malva the programmer, Malva the father, Malva the husband disappearing, and only Malva the operator remaining, incapable of peaceful life. To fight this internal erasure, I began keeping a diary on the pack. It was not a formal diary. I had neither the time, the place, nor the paper for the luxury of a thick notebook. My diary consisted of random artifacts, empty cigarette packs. Even though I didn't smoke, packs were always around, a scrap from a cardboard box of dry rations, a piece of wrapper from a chocolate bar sent by volunteers, anything that could hold ink and not dissolve in the clay dampness. The physical act of writing was an act of affirming personal will over military necessity. I wrote in short, encrypted phrases, using a pencil so as not to attract attention. A pen could freeze or leak. I sat in my dugout, hunched over the shaky crate, my workspace. The light was scarce, a dim red beam from a flashlight that was not supposed to penetrate outside. In this red, intimate light, I turned trash into treasure, chaos into text. The content of my diary on the pack was multi-layered, just like the geometry of the trench itself. First layer, time anchors. The most important thing was the date and the weather. 28/11, 1400, humidity 95%, sky lead. 03/12, stars, night without sound, silence like a threat. The date was critical anchor. The front sought to erase days and months, turning time into a single viscous mass. By recording the date, I affirmed the order of the calendar over the madness of war. It was a finger calendar, but fixed with ink. Second layer, emotion filtering. These were ciphers of longing, short metaphorical notes that only I could decipher. Sweater, blue, wool. Lack of warmth, not in the blanket, in the memory. Reference to the lost sweater. Voice, 300 seconds. Airwaves clean. Battery of life, charged. Reference to 5 minutes of peace. Mud, 4 millimeters on boot. Increases weight by 2 kilograms. Weight of soul, proportional. These entries were a psychological filter. They allowed me to release the emotion onto paper, transfer it to an inanimate object, and free my mind for work. Third layer, logic and code. I used the packs to program my awareness. As a programmer, I knew that a problem broken down into components becomes manageable. Scheme, R17-3, antenna, cable, break 3, dugout, in filter, check grounding. Although this looked like a technical note, it was actually a mental code for maintaining the cable in the mud. Vector of fear, 230 low, 110 high, incorrect data, system reload, sleep. This was the mathematics of fear, an attempt to encode my reactions to the directions of shelling. Fourth layer, witnessing. These were anonymous portraits and short observations of comrades. As in the chapter on the alien blanket, I fixed the humanity. I, blanket, gesture without a name. Warmth is transferred not by word, but by action. The most dangerous part of the cable was beyond the trench. There, where the earth was plowed and open to alien eyes. Going out there, crawling on your belly, feeling the cold, wet clay in search of the thin black line, that was the ultimate act of risk. I remembered the feeling when the hot lead of artillery whistled over my head, while I, lying on my stomach, tried to connect two ends. In these moments, fear was deafening, but duty was louder. I couldn't refuse because a break meant silence, and silence meant defeat. The communication cable was not just a technical device. It was a prayer, a faith in another person. It was trust. I trusted it to carry my voice, and it trusted me to protect it from destruction. I saw how other soldiers looked with envy at my working tool. They understood its value. In their world, the assault rifle was a means of defense, but the cable was a means of coordination, a means of victory. I often thought about what this cable carried. It carried not only encrypted commands and casualty reports, it carried hope, longing, plea, and weariness. It was a capillary through which information flowed, the vital blood of the front. When I returned, dirty, Tired, with my uniform soaked after repairing the cable, I felt a huge, quiet satisfaction. I brought the voice back to this silent world. I connected the thread. My geometry of the trench was dependent on the cable in the mud, and as long as the cable was intact, I, Malva, the keeper of the voice, the programmer who traded code for copper, held on. S. Silence. Long gaze to the east. The expectation of rotation, the worst of enemies. I was not judging, I was witnessing. I was recording their silent courage to remember that we are not just soldiers, but people sharing one geometry. The diary on the pack was my shield against dissolution. Every scrap of paper, written in my uneven handwriting, was proof. Malva is still here. He thinks, he feels, he remembers. I kept these artifacts in a metal tea box, buried in the driest corner of my dugout. This box was my personal vault, the secret archive of myself. If I were to perish, this diary would be the last voice of Malva the man who tried to outshout the voice of war. This diary was the most reliable connection of all that I laid. The cable could be severed by shrapnel, the radio station could fall silent, but the thought fixed on a cigarette packet was unbreakable. I ended every entry with a short symbol, a small, uneven, barely visible dot. This dot was a signature, the end of a line of code, the affirmation of a completed cycle of consciousness. And so, hour after hour, day after day, I continued to write, inscribing my fragile personality into the geometry of garbage, preserving the remnants of clean code in the mud and chaos of war.
The metaphor of mud. If the sky above the trench was the symbol of absolute order and cosmic logic, the earth beneath my feet was the symbol of absolute, all-consuming chaos. And the main element of this chaos was mud. Mud was not just the physical state of the soil after rain, it was the metaphor of my existence and state of mind. In the trench, mud was everywhere. It was the universal matter that erased all distinctions and boundaries. It started with the floor of my dugout, greasy, sticky clay that never dried. It crept up the walls, leaving damp, dark traces. It penetrated through the fabric of the uniform, ate into the skin, clogged the pores. My hands, my working tool, were always covered with this thick, cold crust. Mud was the silent, constant enemy that I, Malva, fought every hour. Mud as burden. Every step along the geometry of the trench was an effort. The mud weighed down my boots, restricted my movements, drained the strength that was vitally necessary for concentration and quick reaction. It was a constant, invisible gravity that pulled downwards, toward powerlessness and fatigue. The physical heaviness of the mud directly correlated with the psychological burden of the war. The heavier my boots were, the heavier my consciousness was. I recalled how in my former life, I hated dust and dirt in my apartment. I aspired to sterile cleanliness, to a flawless surface. Now, I lived in the absolute opposite, in the kingdom of mud. And I understood that cleanliness is a luxury that war takes away first, because cleanliness is a symbol of order. Mud as protection. Paradoxically, mud was also my ally. It was camouflage. My uniform, merged with the color of the clay, made me invisible to the alien eye. Mud, covering everything around, softened blows, absorbed sounds, concealed traces. It was a warm, damp womb I burrowed into to survive. The communication cable, my umbilical cord, was soldered with mud. Mud protected its rubberized sheath from the sun and wind, concealed it from the alien eye. The integrity of my connection depended on the continuity of this muddy camouflage. I crawled on it, breathed it, and it preserved me. Mud as metaphor for the soul. The deepest reflection was internal. I felt the mud penetrating not only the pores and fabric, but the very consciousness. It clouded logic, polluted thoughts, dulled sensations. I, Malva, the man of code, felt the clean, logical schemes in my brain being covered by this viscous, sticky mass. Longing, fear, fatigue. This was the psychological mud that could not be washed away with water. I fought against this. My diary on the packet was an act of cleanliness. White or colored scraps of paper on which the clean lines of the pencil refused to merge with the chaos. This was the confrontation. Order contained in text versus disorder contained in matter. Every time I cleaned a tool, the soldering iron, the radio station, I performed a ritual act of preserving purity. I was protecting the function from annihilation. The cleanliness of the equipment was a reflection of the purity of my purpose. I knew that when I returned, mud would remain with me. It would be an invisible brand, a physical seal of what I had endured. I would wash my hands, but the sensation of this cold, sticky mass would remain on my fingers. The smell of clay and dampness would be a reminder of the geometry of the trench. The return would be heavy. I would have to wash not only my uniform, but my soul. I would have to relearn cleanliness, the cleanliness of thought, the cleanliness of speech, the cleanliness of daily life. But while I was here, mud was my blanket, my foundation. It was honest. It told me the truth about the cruelty of this world, and I had to accept it to survive. Malva, the man of code, became the man of clay. And in this transformation, I found the primal animal strength to continue my mission.
The voice without a name. My main work as Malva was in filtering, sifting out noise to highlight a clean, directed signal. But during long, drawn-out shifts, especially in the deep night, my function allowed for deviations. I switched frequencies, tuning into alien, parallel realities, the voice without a name. The radio airwaves were the collective unconscious of the front. It was a multi-voiced, cacophonous mosaic of commands, cries, sighs, and static. I sat hidden in my clay metaphor of mud, becoming an unwitting listener to alien tragedies and alien victories. It was a forbidden pleasure and a necessary suffering. On one hand, it gave a feeling of control, the knowledge of what was happening outside my geometry of the trench. On the other hand, it was a heavy psychological burden, taking on pain I could not alleviate. The voices without a name were different. I learned to identify them by timbre, speech speed, and the code used. 1. Voice of resolute. Short, clipped phrases, dry mathematical reports on coordinates and ammunition. This voice belonged to commanders, people whose function required a complete absence of emotion. It sounded cold, but comforting in its unwavering logic. It was proof that someone was holding the threads of command. The voice of weariness. Long, drawn-out exhales, quiet, almost whispered responses. This voice carried the weight of long hours of waiting and lack of sleep. It was the brother of my own longing. I heard it and understood that my fatigue was not unique. We were a multitude of singularities gripped by collective exhaustion. The voice of alarm or scream. Rare but piercing moments, a glitch in the code. A voice that broke into a scream or a prayer. This was the voice without a name that was losing its function and returning to the primitive human. I, Malva, the former programmer, logged this glitch as the most dangerous virus, the loss of control. I cut the frequency, immediately returning to my own clean line,
to protect my logic from infection. The airwaves were a constant reminder that I was part of a vast network. I was not just defending my little trench, I was holding my part of the line in the overall invisible scheme. The fragments of conversations were fragments of life, short human remarks that broke through the noise of war. Yes, it's her birthday tomorrow, tell her. Someone's voice, who, like me, was fighting for 5 minutes of peace. Batteries are dead, head, repeat. A voice that was losing connection and control. Batteries, winter, over. A short, encrypted word that sounded like a promise of warmth. These fragments were more important than full reports. They dehumanized the war. They reminded me of the alien blanket, of collective warmth. They affirmed humanity in the world of mud and metal. My deepest reflection was connected with longing. I heard how other voices tried their best to hide their longing. They talked about tactics, but the pauses between the words spoke of home. I understood that longing is a universal code that connects all of us, regardless of the call sign. Listening to the voice without a name, I expanded my personal vault. I added alien faces, alien fears, and alien hopes to it. It was heavy, but necessary. I was a witness not only to my war, but to the collective war. The airwaves were a confessional. People did not know who was listening to them, besides Malva and his filter, and so they released brief, pure confessions of exhaustion and waiting. Sometimes, when I heard the clean technical voice of my own commander, it was like a return from the chaos of alien lives to the order of my function. I answered him in a steady, unemotional tone, returning to the code that protected me. The voice without a name became proof that we are not alone. We were thousands of Malvas filtering chaos and holding the connection. And this invisible, collective work was the foundation of our resilience. My geometry of the trench was small, but my airwaves were infinite. And I, Malva, continued to listen, filter, and remember alien voices to preserve my own humanity.
A dream of coffee. Sleep in the trench was not rest, but a temporary, shallow disconnection. It was a fragile truce between the exhausted body and the strained consciousness. I, Malva, the man of code, could not afford complete oblivion. My sound filter remained switched on, even when my eyes were closed. In these short, intermittent hours, when the dugout plunged into cold, damp silence, my mind entered the brightest, most painful dialogue with the past. All the metaphors, all the artifacts, sweater, mud, voice, merged to create a flawless, crystal-clear reality, a dream of coffee. The smell of coffee was the key. The trench reeked of gunpowder, damp clay, wet uniform, and diesel fumes. These smells were the physical boundaries of my suffering, but in the dream, these boundaries collapsed. I recalled a morning in my city apartment. I saw not an abstract image, but the smallest details. The clean, smooth porcelain of the cup, the steam slowly rising from the dark, aromatic liquid, the faint creak of the chair as I sat down at the table. But the main thing was the sensation, the smell. Not just the smell of coffee, but the smell of the first morning sip, mixed with the aroma of cinnamon and quiet domestic drowsiness. This smell was absolute purity, a symbol of order and absolute safety. It was the antidote to all the alien marks and the smells of the mud. In the dream, my body stopped being cold. I felt the warmth of the kitchen, the warmth of the clean air, the warmth of home. This was the temporary exile of the mud from my consciousness. The light always followed the dream of coffee. I saw a sunbeam that penetrated through the clean, unbroken window and fell onto the polished table.
This light was gentle, calm. It held no threat. It was the light that did not betray my location to the enemy. It was safety, manifested in optical form. I understood that this dream was a psychological mechanism of self-restoration. My brain, tired of filtering chaos, demanded a dose of flawless logic and unconditional comfort. Coffee and light were the clean code that rebooted my mental system. The voice always entered this dream, not the static, interrupted voice of my wife on the phone, but the living, real voice, speaking close, without interference. A voice that asked about my plans for a peaceful day. This voice was the final chord of the symphony of peace. But the dream of coffee always carried pain. It was the pain of realizing the abyss. The clearer and brighter the aroma was, the more distinctly I understood the depth of the mud I was lying in. The memory of clean porcelain intensified the feeling of damp clay under my head. I awoke abruptly, not from a roar, though that happened too, but from the rising contrast. The smell of gunpowder burst into the world of cinnamon, and the harmony collapsed. Malva returned. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the cold and moisture. I inhaled the smell of earth and gunpowder to anchor myself in reality. I needed to remember that I was here, that my mission continues. I took out the diary on the packet and recorded the fact of the dream in short, precise phrases. Coffee. Bright light. Contrast 9 out of 10. Memory working cleanly. This was a report on the state of myself. I knew that the dream of coffee was not just nostalgia, it was a goal. I must survive not for an abstract victory, but to feel that smell again, to see that light, and to hear that voice without interference. My geometry of the trench had to hold on until the moment when I could drink coffee again in a world without fear. And this simple, everyday desire was the most powerful driving force in my chronicle of waiting.
Radio and hope. My existence as Malva the Signalman had been dual until now. I was a critically important function, but a passive participant. I held the thread, but did not control its movement. My sound filter processed information, but I rarely felt the direct, immediate connection of this information to human fates outside our geometry of the trench. This changed on the 62nd day. The night was anxious. The roar of artillery was heavy and constant. It sounded rhythmic, like an endless, dull drum beating the cadence of the threat. I sat in my dugout, half bent, with headphones on my head, filtering the chaos of alien voices from the airwaves. Suddenly, through the crackle of interference and the usual reports, the commander's voice broke through. Not my direct superior, but a voice from a high command frequency. The voice was tense, fast, but perfectly clear. It transmitted a code word, followed by a long, detailed report on a planned evacuation corridor for the civilian population from a neighboring, encircled settlement. My consciousness instantly mobilized. My sound filter engaged at maximum power. I cut off all the background noise, my own fear, the cold, the metaphor of mud. Only the voice and the information remained. This was not just a report. This was a plan for salvation. It contained precise coordinates, time windows, safety conditions, and assembly points. These numbers and words were the vital blood I had to immediately transmit further without a single error. I intercepted the message, recorded it in nervous but accurate handwriting in the diary, on the packet which now lay open on the crate. I fixed every detail, every pause, every symbol. The realization hit me with a heavy physical blow. My job, my connection, my cable in the mud, all of it directly affected hundreds of lives. These numbers and codes were a promise of rescue for women, children, and the elderly. I transmitted the information to my command frequency. My voice was steady, unemotional, strictly functional. I had to ensure not an ounce of my fear or my longing entered this vitally important transmission. After the transmission, I sat motionless, in complete silence. My body was trembling not from cold,
but from tension. I felt the weight of my call sign, Malva, as never before. I was the key. I was the thin needle that had to pierce the chaos so that life could slip out. This information was hope. But hope was fragile. It depended on the accuracy of my reception, the integrity of my cable, the steadiness of my voice. I walked out to the observation post. For the first time, I looked not at the stars in order, but at the earth, at the direction of that encircled settlement. I stared into the darkness knowing that hundreds of people there were waiting for this invisible, digital thread of salvation. Radio and hope became one. My airwaves ceased to be a laboratory of analysis and became a highway of life. I spent several hours in continuous tension, monitoring the frequencies. I heard other voices picking up these codes, confirming routes, preparing equipment. I was a witness to the vast, invisible work of rescue, and my thread was woven into this tapestry. At one point, through an alien, distant channel, I heard a voice very quietly and quickly transmit a confirmation. First group is out. Code Malva. Clear reception. My heart stopped. My call sign, my name, it was mentioned in the context of rescue. This was the highest reward I could receive, not a medal, but the confirmation that my function had worked. I returned to the working radio stations. My sound filter switched on again, but now my mission had a new meaning. My cable in the mud was a bridge to the voice, and I had to keep it intact until the day when the voice would become a physical presence. I was Malva, the keeper of the voice, and for the sake of these 5 minutes of peace, it was worth enduring everything else.
A letter to nowhere. After the explosion of hope that the radio airwaves brought in the previous chapter, a deep, meditative calm settled. The evacuation was successfully completed, and the tension subsided, leaving behind a devastating fatigue. In these hours of repose, when the cable in the mud was whole and the voice without a name carried no urgent threats, I, Malva, the man of code, decided to write. This was not a message for the diary on the packet, short, encrypted, technical. This was a letter, a long, coherent narrative addressed to her, my wife, my main anchor to the past and the future. I knew the chance of sending it was minimal. This was a letter to nowhere, but written for everything. I used a rare, clean piece of packaging paper that came with the humanitarian aid and a hard, well-sharpened pencil. I sat in the red, intimate light of my flashlight, and word by word, I fought for the purity of my handwriting and the purity of my thoughts. The purpose of this letter was not to convey information, but to preserve identity. I had to transfer onto paper not the mud and fear, but the remnants of Malva the man, so as not to forget who he was before this geometry of the trench. I started with the most difficult thing, the description of daily life, but I filtered it just as I filtered the sound. About the cold and the sweater, I did not write about the piercing, sticky cold. I wrote about the lost sweater as a treasure that awaits me. I remember the blue color of its wool. All colors here are shades of gray, so I hold the memory of blue as a symbol of a clear, peaceful sky. About the mud, I did not write about the heaviness and smell of the clay. I wrote about the earth as a foundation. We sit deep, and this depth is the guarantee that our root will withstand any wind. I know that your hands are clean, and your purity is my beacon. About the threep, I did not write about the intermittent, nightmare-filled sleep. I described the dream of coffee. I remember the smell of cinnamon in the morning coffee. It is the purest code that reboots my consciousness. It is flawless, and for its sake, I wake up. I described ideas, not facts. I created an alternative reality, a paper bridge between the trench and home. I recalled the 5 minutes of peace, our short conversations, and I wrote her answers to the questions she did not ask, but I heard in the pauses of her voice. About my fear, I am not afraid of the roar. I am afraid of the silence that is absent in your voice. As long as I hear you, my fear remains manageable. About my purpose, I am not here because I have to be. I am here to return,
and the goal is pure, untainted. I work on this return every day, like a complex but solvable task. About my daughter, I did not write about the war. I wrote about philosophy. Tell her that the stars are the most precise geometry, and that order always defeats chaos, and that Dad is looking at the same Big Dipper as she is. The letter to nowhere was an act of preserving language. In the trench, language was simplified to commands, curses, and codes. It lost shades, nuances, lyricism. On paper, I restored my vocabulary, defended the complexity of human communication. I preserved poetry for a future life. I also fixed the humanity of those around me, the alien blanket, the anonymous courage in the radio airwaves, but I translated this witnessing into the language of love. There are people here who share their last warmth, and this reminds me that the human heart is stronger than any trench. When I finished, the paper was filled with neat, small handwriting. It breathed calm, logic, and tenderness. I reread it twice, memorizing my own words so that they would become an internal code. I folded the letter in 3 and sealed it in a plastic bag, a hermetic capsule of time and personality. I placed it next to the diary on the packet, in the metal box. This letter was Malva translated into text. It was a ready answer to the question of what I was doing and who I remained. I could not send it now, but I continued to hold the connection and continued to live so that one day this letter would be a message not to nowhere, but home.
The Code of Return. The finale of the Chronicle of Waiting. Time, stretched and compressed by the geometry of the trench, reached a point of singularity. 90 days. 3 months that felt like a lifetime, transforming Malva the programmer into Malva the function. But after the radio and hope, after the letter to nowhere, after all the night monologues, I ceased to be just a function. I became a programmed algorithm with a single purpose. This was the code of return. It was simple, like the binary system, and complex, like a neural network. It united all the fragments, artifacts, and metaphors that I had collected and analyzed in the mud and cold. I sat in my earth burrow, which I now called the control room, a place where chaos was forced into order. I realized that survival is not luck, but mathematics. The strict adherence to protocol. The code of return consisted of 3 main principles and a series of auxiliary functions. Principle 1, signal integrity. Name, voice. Task, maintaining the absolute purity of the channel leading to the original reality, home. I realized that the voice of my wife from the 5 minutes of peace was not an emotional weakness, but a calibration constant. It was the reference signal that I had to hear and protect from the noise of the front. Anti-noise function, sound filter. My brain had to automatically cut off all negative, destructive frequencies, fear, despair, malice. They were external interference that polluted the code of return. I refused to register them. I reacted only to facts and commands. Anchor function, dream of coffee. Every memory of the smell of cinnamon, the clean light, the lost sweater, had to be processed as a gathering point in space and time. I visualized them every day, not as a dream, but as an inevitable future. Coffee was the goal, not the nostalgia. Contact function, letter to nowhere. The letter, sealed in a hermetic capsule, became proof of signal integrity. I preserved my complex, lyrical language and my love in an undamaged format. If the communication cable could be severed, the cable of the soul had to remain whole. Principle 2. Geometry of shelter. Name, mud. Task, integrating the physical reality of the trench into the survival system, turning the burden into a tool. The metaphor of mud was transformed. Mud ceased to be a symbol of pollution. It became a symbol of shelter,
and low-profile stability. Camouflage function, soul camouflage. I accepted the metaphor of mud as a second skin. Inconspicuousness, silence, minimal movements. This was the ideal camouflage for a function. The less I manifested myself, the man, the higher the chance of survival for Malva, the function. Immobility function, confronting chaos. In a world where chaos could destroy you at any moment, one's own immobility and physical discipline were an act of defiance. I conserved every calorie, every movement, channeling free energy into airwave analysis and equipment maintenance. Purification function, ritual. The daily cleansing of the equipment and the diary on the packet from physical mud became mental hygiene. It was a ritual that maintained order in the local space. If I could control the cleanliness of my cable, I could control my fate. Principle 3. Transmission efficiency. Name, radio. Task, ensuring the maximum speed and accuracy of all outgoing and incoming data, because speed is life. The experience of radio and hope taught me that my voice must be an absolute instrument. Prediction function. Airwave analysis. I expanded my sound filter for predictive analysis. I listened not only to the content, but to the rhythm, intonation, and patterns of the voice without a name. I anticipated the threats and needs of the network to reduce reaction time to milliseconds. Precision function. Mathematics. Coordinates, frequencies, code words. Not a single error. I repeated them in my mind, double-checked them on the diary on the packet dozens of times. The lives of other people became my responsibility for accuracy. Brotherhood function, collective warmth. I understood that the alien blanket and the voice without a name create a backup of my hope. Unity in the chain is the stability of the entire system. I was responsible for the work of my cell, not only for myself, but for the neighbor, Ivan, Serhiy, for everyone who shared the mud with me. Final protocol. End of part. I completed the analysis and programming of the code of return. I put down the pencil. The metal box with the diary and the letter was closed and safely hidden. I picked up the headset. My fingers, covered with the thin, ingrained metaphor of mud, moved quickly and precisely. Over the control panel. I connected the communication cable, checked the grounding and the signal level. Everything was perfect. I looked at the dark, damp corner of the dugout. This was my control room, my bridge. The old Malva, the man who searched for problems in code to fix them with logic, died here. The new Malva, the man who searched for problems in reality to neutralize them with action, was born. I recalled my wife's voice, her short, trembling, "I'm waiting." I recalled my daughter watching the Big Dipper in the peaceful sky. My own voice cut into the airwaves, steady, unemotional, clean. Malva, online, system nominal, awaiting further commands. This was not just a report. It was the affirmation of the code of return. I am here, I am working, and I will return. The chronicle of waiting has ended. The chronicle of action, governed by a new, unbreakable algorithm, has begun.
The finger calendar. After coding my consciousness with the code of return, I moved on to the most difficult task, managing time. In the trench, waiting was not just a pause, but an active, exhausting phase of the war. Time, which stretched like clay and compressed into the instant of an explosion, had to be defeated by method and discipline. My main tool became the finger calendar. I did not trust clocks and official dates on the diary on the packet. They were too abstract and easily erased by chaos. I trusted physical markers, tangible evidence that life was moving forward and the end of this captivity was inevitable. First marker, scratches on the wood. In the very corner of my dispatcher's office on a vertical reinforcement beam, I began scratching hash marks. This was a primitive, primal act of fixation. Each thin, uneven line,
made with the tip of a knife, was a day endured. I did not make them daily, that would have been too agonizing. I made them in blocks, after the successful completion of micro-missions, after repairing the cable in the mud, after a clean reception of critical codes, after a successful night shift. A scratch was a reward, a confirmation of the effectiveness of the code of return. I looked at these vertical, solitary lines. They were the graph of my resilience. They said that the physical reality of the trench was wearing down, but the will was preserved. Second marker, cycles of nature. I, Malva, the human logician, stopped ignoring nature. I studied its cycles as an external, immutable code. Water and mud. My finger calendar was dependent on humidity. Days when water collected at the bottom of the trench, making life unbearable, were days of punishment. Days when the soil dried up and became firmer, speeding up movement and cable repair, were days of progress. The sensation of a dry, clean clod of clay under my hand was the best signal that time was working for me. Light. I tracked the duration of daylight. The slow, undeniable return of long days was a promise of summer, a promise of the end of the cruelest, coldest months. I recorded this in the diary on the packet as signal growth. Third marker, the physical body, the finger itself. My body was the most intimate and honest calendar. I tracked the healing of small wounds, the hardening of the skin on my fingers from the cold and the work with the cable. I looked at my index finger, the very one that pressed the radio transmission button, and hope. A scar from an accidental cut during a cable repair was on its pad. The speed of this scar's healing became my personal, biological clock. As long as the scar was open, I was wounded. As soon as it was covered with new, thin, but durable skin, it was a completed cycle. This calendar was irrefutable proof of overcoming. It said, "You are alive. You are recovering. Your body follows the code of return." Fourth marker, the psychological scheme, longing. I stopped fighting longing. I included it in the algorithm. Longing for the voice and the dream of coffee was the unit of measurement. The stronger the longing, the brighter the scent of cinnamon in the dream, the closer I felt the point of rotation. My internal tension became a time detector. I used this pain as energy, directing it to intensify work and strengthen discipline. Managing the finger calendar distracted me from the oppression of the monologues of the night. It replaced passive waiting with active, methodical accumulation of days. I was the engineer of my own time. I knew that rotation would be unexpected. It would disrupt the established rhythm, but thanks to the finger calendar, I would be ready for the transition. I would gather the diary and the letter, disconnect the equipment, and hand over the clean channel to the new signalman. Chapter 17. And when I see the new operator, his eyes will be full of clean, dirt-free innocence. And I will know that my finger calendar has worked. I handed over the baton, having kept my part unbreakable.
The baton of the voice. The event came suddenly, like the execution of a deferred command in a software code. The diary on the packet was short of 2 full cycles of the finger calendar until the supposed end date. But the front did not acknowledge schedules or forecasts. It acknowledged only necessity. In the morning, after an anxious yet quiet dawn, I heard a sound that was unusual in the geometry of the trench. Hurried, uncertain footsteps in the mud, steps that carried the smell of the rear and unawareness. A new man entered my dispatcher's office. He was young, dressed in a clean new uniform, and seemed too large for the low, pressed-down ceiling of the dugout. His eyes, wide open, were full of the pure, untouched mud of innocence and fear. He was unprepared for the metaphor of mud, for the chronicle of waiting, for the monologues of the night. He introduced himself with an uncertain, high voice. The call sign was Kalyana, viburnum. Kalyana, another flower,
another bright, fragile symbol in the metallic hell. My Malva function immediately switched to the teacher function. The code of return demanded that the thread of connection not break during the handover. I had to pass on to him not only the equipment, but my experience, my sound filter, my logic. The baton of the voice began. I started with the infrastructure. I showed him the cable in the mud, my umbilical cord. I explained its importance not in terms of communication, but in terms of survival. This cable is your heart. If it is silent, you are dead. Repair is not a task, but a reflex. You crawl to it until you hear the whistle. I explained to him the geometry of the trench, the logic of the curved lines, the protection of the parapet, the drainage system so that the mud wouldn't drown the equipment. I passed on the knowledge of the space that was recorded in my muscle memory. The most important thing was to tune his sound filter. I put my headphones on him and made him listen to the chaos. Do you hear that hum? That's background noise. It has to disappear. You must only hear this. I showed him the frequencies of the threat, the differences between grad and mortar fire. I passed on the codes that saved the civilian population, radio and hope. I impressed upon him, precision is your only armor. I noticed how fear grew in Kalyan's eyes. His face was losing the cleanliness of the new uniform and was being covered with the first, barely perceptible shadows of the metaphor of mud. I understood his state. He was overloaded with information, overwhelmed with fear. I stopped. I took my diary on the packet out of the buried box. I did not hand it over, it was my private archive. But I took a clean sheet of packing paper and wrote 3 short, unencrypted phrases, the 3 principles of the code of return for a novice. Breathe slowly. Mud is a wall. Acceptance of the environment. The voice of home is the main priority. Do not lose it. Preservation of the goal. Knock on wood. Do not give up. Your call sign is your anchor. Faith in creation. I placed this sheet on the shaky crate next to the radio station. It was his artifact. Then I left. I left Kalyana alone with the function, with the geometry of the trench, and with 3 lines of code. My body ceased to be a function. I became a man preparing for departure. I rolled up my bedding, gathered my metal box with the diary and a letter to nowhere. I said goodbye to my comrades with a quiet nod. Hugs were inappropriate in the mud. I thanked Ivan for the alien blanket without words, simply touching his shoulder. I left the dugout. My last look was at Kalyana. He was sitting in my corner, headphones pressed to his head, absorbing the chaos and trying to find the clean voice. He was already Malva, the new incarnation of the signalman. I climbed out of the trench. The ground felt different, temporary, unstable. I took the first step back toward the light, toward the world, toward the voice.
The return of Malva. The way back was marked not by speed, but by accumulated memory. My body, tired from the geometry of the trench, moved automatically, but my consciousness conducted the last, most important monologue, the monologue of transition. I left Malva, the function, leaving him to Kalina and the dark, damp dugout. Now I was the man who was carrying the mud and the light inside himself. The great kilometers, which greeted us with threat on the way there, now saw us off with a heavy, silent gaze. I saw the same mutilated trees, the same craters, but my perception had changed. Before it was chaos, now it was a battlefield that was endured. The car shook, but this physical vibration was a comfort. It masked the internal trembling. I held the metal box in my hands, the vault, where the diary on the packet and the letter to nowhere lay. These artifacts were heavy, like the weight of the time endured. I recalled the monologues of the night and the dream of coffee. These psychological anchors were my true salvation. I understood that I returned not whole, but more resilient. The entry into the ghost city was a cultural shock. The light, the abundance, the speed, the carefree, clean faces, all of it rushed upon me like a wave of unreality. The world that lived without filters seemed deafening and unnatural. My sound filter worked at its limit, cutting off unnecessary, peaceful noise, seeking only the truth,
I noticed that my fingers involuntarily searched for the communication cable, a habit ingrained in my muscle memory. My body sought protection in a half-bent position, ready to fall into the mud at the first sharp sound. The geometry of the trench had permanently restructured my physiology. I knew that Malva would not disappear. He would remain inside, like a reserve code, activating at the first threat. I would be a programmer, but a programmer who knows the price of system integrity. The last stretch of the journey was the longest. I left my comrades and drove alone to meet the voice. And then, the building, the door, the entrance. I climbed the clean, dry steps. My dirty, heavy boots seemed out of place, crude in this sterile space. I felt the metaphor of mud at its peak. I brought the front home. I stopped. I needed to restore the logic of the peaceful world. I touched the lost sweater which lay in a packed bag with my belongings. My wife had brought it here from the evacuation. It was clean and warm. I inhaled its scent. The smell of purity defeated the smell of gunpowder. I took out the letter to nowhere. I did not open it. I knew that its mission was complete. It had preserved me whole. I opened the door, and I saw her. The voice became flesh. She stood there and she smiled. Her face was tired, but her eyes were bright, cloudless, without traces of mud and fear. She was flawless purity, a perfect code. I could not speak. Words stuck in my throat. Too heavy, too complex to express. She stepped toward me. She hugged me tightly. In that moment of embrace, the most important thing happened. Physical reality overlapped the virtual world. The warmth of her body drove out the cold of the trench. The voice sounded not in headphones, but close by, softly. Malva, you are here. You are home. And I understood. My mission was completed. The code of return had worked. I remained a man who remembers the mud, but chose the light. I returned not as a victor, but as a keeper of purity. I closed my eyes and inhaled. The smell of coffee and sweater was ubiquitous. I was home.